Okay, hi, I'm Tom McCambridge. I'm Head of Creative at Athernet, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about responsive design. We're a full-service digital marketing agency, as Dan sort of just talked about. My background personally is in design, so this is sort of a hot topic of conversation within my community and our community. I'm going to talk a little bit about responsive and adaptive design, whatever you like to call it. So just as a quick overview, I'm going to be talking first about the UX of mobile, the sort of user experience of where we've come from in terms of mobile web browsing and how that's developed into how we use the web today. And then talk a little bit about what responsive design actually is and how that fits into mobile browsing today. Why you should bother with it, why that's important in terms of whether you're from a background of being an agency yourself or if you've got your own business or e-commerce website. And then a little bit about the future, where it's heading, what we're likely to see in terms of responsive design in the next couple of years. So, to start with, let's just have a look at desktop and mobile usage over the last few years. So this is a graph which obviously shows at the side number of millions of users browsing the web since 2006 to a projected figure of 2016. Obviously you can see over that time we've been gradually increasing desktop usage of the browsing the web to a point here where there's quite a considerable amount of people browsing it, but we can see that in the next couple of years that's going to start to plateau out and that number will almost start to decline. And if we look at how mobile usage compares to that, we can see that obviously this number started off a lot lower in 2006 and it's been gradually increasing at sort of more harsh rate than desktop usage, to a point where now we can see that it's almost getting to the same point of desktop users, and we see that if it keeps going the rate it's going, by 2016 mobile usage is actually going to overtake desktop usage. So that's really something we need to think about now. There's this whole divide of desktop websites and mobile websites, and what we're here to talk about today is where that line is sort of decreasing really, and how we can make desktop websites and mobile websites one and the same. So if we look at where desktop websites started, this is obviously the first website that was ever on the web. It was a little bit of an experiment to make sure networks could talk to each other and messages could be transmitted from one device to another. Has anyone seen this website? We've come across this before, I'm sure a few people have. And basically it was obviously very simple. It was just a case of text, a few little links. Images weren't really prevalent at that point, but that's the journey where it began really. And over the years we've developed some incredible desktop websites from this point. We've gone through various stages of HTML. Obviously some of you will be familiar, that's the language that we build websites in, and CSS and all different plugins and things. So we've really come on a journey from here, and there's some amazing websites out there now. And really when we think about mobile usage and mobile websites, we kind of went back to the same point. We went back to having these very basic layouts of text and links and very basic images, so it's not too dissimilar to the very first website that was on the net. This is obviously a lot later, and by this point desktop websites were a lot more advanced. But we kind of went back to this square one and was looking at websites like this, which were very basic, and it was sort of time consuming and there were a lot of limitations there. One of the main limitations was obviously the navigation. The phones and the devices at the time relied upon joysticks or rocker switches that just simply allowed us to go up or down, left and right. So when we were thinking about navigating websites, it was very time consuming to go from one link to something at the other side of the page. You'd have to click one at a time to go through that, and it was frustrating. So that was one of the sort of major limitations in terms of navigation that we had. A couple of other limitations that we had obviously with the data. We weren't connected to the kind of networks that we're connected to today, so it was very time consuming to capture that information on our devices, and it's not something we were truly mobile to do. And also the browsers on the devices simply didn't allow us to access the full-size versions of the site, so we were restricted to these WAP versions of the site, or very basic websites as we just looked at. But when we think about mobile devices today, we've kind of moved on to this, and these are some of the things that sort of we consider to be mobile devices today, things like smartphones, iPods, tablets, obviously. And a lot of the restrictions that we've just had a look at have been removed. We're not so much restricted now by data, because a lot of us are connected to Wi-Fi or fast networks. we're not restricted by the screen sizes or anything. We can deliver that kind of information very easily to these devices, and we're not restricted by the images and things like that. It's still something that we need to bear in mind and we need to consider when building websites, because while these can browse full-size websites or desktop websites, we need to think about, is that the best thing we should be doing, or is that really tackling the problem? And obviously with those devices, we've kind of moved away from having to navigate on this rocker type device of up, down, left and right, to being a little bit more reliant on touch. And that really changes a lot in terms of browsing the website and accessing the data yourselves. And that's true, of course, of desktop sites as well, because sideways scrolling is not something that's considered good practice in desktop sites. So we're sort of moving away from doing this to doing this, which is up and down, which we don't mind doing. That's becoming a lot more intuitive with the kinds of devices that we have that rely on touch. We, of course, don't want to rely too heavily on touch, because in the future there are, well, even now, we can access the web on devices such as smart TVs and things. But this is obviously a big player thanks to the likes of Apple and HTC and all the kinds of mobile devices we've got. So when we think about mobile, touch is quite a considerable market. We also need to think about how we're accessing the web. We used to see trends that people would, when they wanted to access the web, they'd go to and fire up the PC, they'd dial up to the internet, and they'd access the information there. But now we're looking into a generation where 77% of viewers will use another device while they're watching TV. We've moved into a multi-device generation, really, and there's two different kinds of users we see within that, which are obviously simultaneous users and sequential users. A sequential user is someone who might be looking at something on the laptop while they're watching TV and then pick up that journey elsewhere. They're using various different types of devices at different times. Sorry, that's a simultaneous one. A sequential user is someone who would do something once at a time, so they look at a device and they'd pick up that journey elsewhere. So the way in which we access the web has changed. It's not so reliant on just one device anymore. So what we're thinking about there is how we can create seamless journeys and create seamless brands and get that message across in one simple, easy way. So I'm going to just swap over to a demo on my phone now to show you a couple of journeys that I've come across recently. So this is an example of a fairly typical mobile website these days. I was trying to find some speakers for my car at the weekend, and I've got this fantastic device which allows me to access full-size websites, but you can imagine my frustration when I was faced with this, which is not too dissimilar to the very first mobile websites we had. So we try and look at categories. I've got this huge screen, but the size of the text is not proportional. It's quite a time-consuming thing to try and find the information, and I'm restricted because I might want to filter the results, but I can't seem to do that. So we try and go to the desktop version of the site where there should be a link to opt out of that, and there isn't. So I ultimately went elsewhere. So that's, in my eyes, not really an acceptable way to be handling a mobile website these days. And so you might think that this might be as well. So if we have a look at the Apple website, this is completely polar opposite. This is a full desktop version site which I'm accessing on my phone. And again, this isn't really a good user experience, because to get to the sections that I'm looking at, I'm having to zoom in a lot. Text size, I can't see all the information that I want to see easily on the screen. It's not just a case of scrolling up and down. I'm having to go left and right like I used to have to do, but now on a full desktop site. So it's not really a smooth user experience. So we've had a look at sort of an example of a mobile website these days, and that's the sort of thing we came across. It was quite a frustrating user experience. And so was this, in effect. This is certainly possible, but it's not really the best user experience either. And a statistic to back this up as such is 80% of customers will abandon a mobile site if they have a bad user experience, and that's certainly true of myself, but a lot of people as well. That is very true. So how can we handle that? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today in terms of responsive or adaptive websites. And there's various different terms that are battered around for this, but I'm just going to sort of give my own interpretation of them. So we'll start with adaptive web design. Now, adaptive web design we see is really relying heavily on what we call breakpoints. We'll have different template versions of a site, as in a full desktop version of a site, a tablet version of a site, and a mobile version of a site. And there is a distinction between that and having a mobile site. It's not quite the same. It's still an adaptive site. We'll use the same markup and it will still have the same content as the full desktop site, but the CSS will rearrange that depending on the size of the browser that you're looking at it on. And it will adapt the information, it will adapt the layout to suit the size of the browser that you're in. And a perfect example of that is our own website. This says the Athernet site. And as we see the browser size decrease, the layout changes slightly in order to fulfill the width of the browser. And adaptive design really allows us to sort of take out elements and put elements in that would be suitable to the type of device that you'd be on. The main change you might see here is that the navigation has changed to a drop-down menu. Because on things on like an iPhone, for example, obviously that brings up the barrel roll, and it's a lot more intuitive to use that than it is to try and zoom in and hit the links that you would. So that's an example of an adaptive site. Responsive is, we see as a lot more fluid. A good analogy of this is, think of a bowl and you pour water into a bowl. The water will fill up the amount of space that it's got. It still relies on breakpoints, so you get to certain parts and it will change the layout significantly. But as you gradually go between each step, it will fill the amount of space that it has. So an example of that is something like the Smashing Magazine website. So if we resize the browser on this, we can see that the elements themselves are increasing proportionally to the size of space that we've got on the screen. So this is a lot more fluid in the way it works. But essentially there's no bad way as such to handle this. There's just a few different elements that you can use between each one to have what is essentially a flexible website. So no matter what term you apply to it and no matter what method you use, an amalgamation of them just gives you a responsive or an adaptive site, but they're all flexible, and it's using that approach to target different browser sizes to really get the layout that you want for various mobile devices. So we're actually rebuilding our own website to sort of use both elements of these to so we're not relying too heavily on the breakpoints. We're sort of sit in between there, and so we've got percentages and things like that which will work between the breakpoints. So what we've looked at really is we're highly reliant on the browser size, the screen size, but more in particular the width. We've mentioned that we don't like really scrolling across when we're on a phone. What we don't mind doing so much is scrolling up and down. That's intuitive now, so that's what we want to see. Is sort of we want to have certain definitions of screen sizes and move between them seamlessly. And we do that obviously with the CSS. We use things called media queries. So what this is doing, this is a bit of code that would say when you get to 960 pixels wide, show this information. Or when you get to 320 pixels wide, show this layout instead. And that's just, and within that, that's where we can start fitting in our responsive things. So instead of saying if it's 960 pixels, show this box at 300 pixels, it will be a percentage of that, and that becomes a lot more fluid then. So if it's 960 pixels wide, say something's 80% wide, if that number then increases, it would then be 80% of that. So it's all proportional, and that's how you get this sort of fluid grid to work. So essentially what we're trying to avoid really is this period of having a design for desktop sites, a design for tablets or phones, and a design for things like smart TVs. Having one design that fits all. We're trying to go to something that it's not so much coming up with a design for a mobile or a desktop, but having one simple design, but applying different styles and different layouts, so it's seamless. So we're wanting to make sure that brand message is consistent across all devices. But it's also important to make sure the site loads quickly and clearly on any mobile device too. We talked earlier about not being so restricted by the size of data, but when you take that out of the equation, we are still, to a certain degree on metered contracts and things. So we don't still want to be serving up massive images if we don't have to. And that's really where the adaptive techniques come into it, because it might not be a case of, just scale this all down. We can perhaps drill down and decide discover what device that we're on and serve different images and different techniques to that device, so it's not too intensive. So we can still bear that in mind. Another important thing with adaptive design are the 2 C's. The first one, content. Content is, the most important thing in any new project, whether it's offline or online. But we need to think about all the elements that we're going to have and how that fits in a responsive or a mobile environment. A perfect example of this would be videos. Videos on the web, obviously, over the last few years, initially relied heavily upon Flash as a technology, which is no good for Apple devices. They won't run Flash. So it's thinking about how will that content be served on mobile devices. It's not just a case of take that out. It should be something that works across desktop, it works across mobile and tablets and on phones. And another important thing is the context in which we're using. We talked earlier about these simultaneous and sequential users, but we need to think about how we're actually accessing the web. We know it's no longer a case of simply going to the computer and finding that information and going. We need to think about what information is shown in each device and how each stage is responsive. And not just in how it looks, but in how it works too. A little quote. Mobile users are 20 times more likely to click on a map than desktop users, and people who make a call are much more likely to convert. So an example of this may be someone who's looking for some product on your e-commerce website, and they set off to your store and they pick that journey up somewhere else. It's not so much the product that they would be looking for on your site anymore. It might be how to find your office. So that information needs to be, take more of a priority on the mobile version of the site. We're also thinking about how the elements that we work with on the site and how they interact with the user. So things like HTML elements and CSS tricks and things. An important thing to consider is that if this was sort of a wireframe of a site and this is an image carousel and this is your navigation, on the desktop site you might have a drop down here, and that hover over might not work as well on a responsive design. So we need to think that's the point where perhaps the navigation should break and become a drop down. So it's easy to get that information without any barriers that would stop people getting into that information. So obviously just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because we've got access to all these JavaScript tricks and things that we can put on websites doesn't mean that we should put them on all our devices, because it just might not work and it ends up leading to a frustrating experience that ultimately people will navigate away and go elsewhere. There's other limitations such as the size that we make links on a page. A little statistic is that the average touch of a finger equates to about 42 pixels on the screen. Obviously with different device resolutions and things, that does differ in terms of how that equates to dimension, but we need to think about that in terms of the text size when we get to different mobile versions of the site. So why bother? Why is this important to you? Well, really, depending on the size of your business, or in fact the business that you're in, creating an app for each product. Sorry, we've got someone coming in. Yep, no worries, take a seat. Right, so I'll just start again. So why bother? Why is this important to you? Well, depending on the size of the business or the business that you're in, creating an app for each product or each part of your business could be very costly, depending on which way or which method you decide to do that. That's something that we're going to talk a little bit more about in the next seminar. But that could be quite a costly experience. And by creating a responsive site, it sort of eliminates that process, because you can target all the users and all the mobile users that you have, because the website will respond to that. It's also future friendly to a certain degree, as much as we can be, because no matter what devices come out, if you're responsive to certain resolutions and screen widths, you know that you're not putting yourself too much out of the market. So if you design something specifically for iPad or iPhone, if another device comes out with a different resolution, it's an easier change to make rather than having to make a whole new app or something. It's just a case of changing the CSS perhaps, or in many cases changing nothing at all if it's responsive. So you've got the opportunity to reach a massive market really. It's important that we're looking at mobile users. When the graph that we looked at in the very beginning slide, mobile usage is, it's not something you can ignore. It's also thinking about in terms of another step of accessibility. People talked for many years about being able to change the text size on a screen or having it on a certain coloured background, but really responsive design is another form of accessibility. It's taking it to that next level where people are using many of these different devices, and new devices are coming out every week and every month. We need to be able to access those people without just saying, well, here's a desktop site or here's a mobile site. It shouldn't matter. We need to sort of remove that distinction. Another quote: it should no longer be considered a special feature, responsive design. It's how any self-respecting website should behave in 2012, said by someone at Disney. And it's true, really. It's in this day and age, we've got the technology that we can use to target all these devices, so we should be harnessing that now. It shouldn't be a special feature. It shouldn't be something that you should have to pay more for. It's just simply how your website should work. In terms of how we tackle projects now, we've kind of gone from creating full desktop sites and trying to scale them down into mobile versions to really thinking about how it would work on a phone first. More and more people obviously are using the phones, so the journey will start here. So we need to think about how that will look first and start adding features to that, the bigger and more data you've got really. And that's how we work. What next? Well, it's hard to say really. It's a bit of a sort of ongoing thing, and there's always new CSS bits coming out and HTML bits coming out. But really, being responsive will allow you to cope with a lot. As new devices are released, it will allow you to deal with that as those devices come out. And there are things we need to consider. A term that's been coined by Apple is sort of the retina displays. We need to think about the resolutions of images that we can serve to certain devices and things like that. As I mentioned earlier as well, we can't really rely too heavily on touch. Although it's a big thing now with the rise of smart TVs and things, we need to think about other input devices that are going to be used, such as remote controls and things. And we are going to, with that as an example, we are soon going to be able to define and change markup, the CSS, depending on what input device is being used. So we might be able to define whether the pointer is coarse, a finger for instance, or fine, which would be the click of a mouse. So again, looking at a media query like we looked at earlier, we might be able to say, well, when the pointer is a finger, make the checkboxes a little bigger, make that a bit easier to hit. So that's an example of being able to target the pointer. And we'll also be looking at nested media queries to help define a little bit more about the device that's being viewed upon. So as well as saying, is it this width, show this layout, we'll be able to drill down a little bit further and say, if it's this width, the resolution is this, and if it's black and white, for instance, if it's an Amazon Kindle, show these images, because we need to think about, if we've got high-res images and really nice nav and things, we need to think about how those would look and how we can swap them out for ones that would look better on certain devices. So that's really how we can start to think about responsive as we go forward. So just as a quick recap really, we've talked about how mobile sites have evolved, where they started from, sort of the limitations that we had, the technology that we use now in order to deal with responsive design, some of the processes that we use, media queries, and also a little bit about what's to come. I would say the overall message is mobile isn't something we can sort of brush under the carpet. It's something that is very important now, and we have all the technologies. We're not limited by anything really. We can do all this stuff, so we should be doing it. We should be thinking about the content and the context and really delivering websites that work across anything. In many ways, we've kind of come, nothing should have changed too much from this. In terms of how things look, of course they have, but this was really an experiment to deliver a message. It wasn't too dependent on what device was at the other end. It was important that this was delivered in the way it was originally intended. And of course, that was responsive too. So why have we moved into a market that was so dependent on fixed width websites that don't work on mobile? So, any questions?